The night Claire Weston was thrown out of her in-laws' mansion, she had exactly 3 things left: a suitcase she'd packed in 4 minutes, a baby girl due in 6 weeks, and a key she hadn't touched in 5 years. The key belonged to her grandfather's house, a house nobody had lived in since the morning Henry Weston collapsed alone in his garden. His pocket watch stopped at exactly 7:42 a.m., and the doctors called it a heart attack. She had believed them. Everyone had believed them. But that was before she found the cameras still running in the basement, before she found the footage, before she watched a stranger walk into her grandfather's kitchen, share a cup of tea, and walk back out 20 minutes before Henry hit the ground. Now a man worth $4 billion was standing on her porch, offering her $10 million for this house. Not for the land, not for the house, for what was underneath it. And somewhere beneath her feet, buried under 40 years of silence and sacrifice, her grandfather had left her something that could either change the world or get her killed before her daughter ever took her first breath. Claire looked down at her hands. Then she picked up the key. Some inheritances come with money. Henry Weston left her a war. The rain came down hard on Route 9 that November night, the kind of cold Vermont rain that feels personal, like the sky itself has decided you've had enough good days and it's time to balance the books. Claire Weston drove with both hands on the wheel and one eye on the road and the other on the rearview mirror, watching the lights of the Ashford estate disappear behind the tree line. The mansion's iron gates had closed behind her with a sound she would remember for the rest of her life. Not a slam, not a bang, just a slow, deliberate clang, the sound of a door being shut on everything she thought her life was going to be. She had been inside that house for 3 years. She had loved a man who grew up inside those walls. And she had buried that man 4 months ago on a Tuesday morning in October, standing in the rain in a black dress that didn't fit right anymore because she was 7 months pregnant and nothing fit right, while his mother stood 20 feet away and didn't once look at her. Thomas Ashford had been many things. He had been kind in a way that surprised people who knew his family. He had been funny in the quiet way that only reveals itself after midnight. He had been the kind of man who remembered exactly how you took your coffee and never once made you feel small for needing anything. And then he was gone. Single vehicle accident on Route 17, wet road, no witnesses. The kind of accident that happens every winter in New England and means nothing to anyone except the people who are left behind to figure out how to keep breathing. Claire had kept breathing. She had kept breathing through the funeral and through the weeks of silence in that enormous house, and through the dinners where no one spoke, and through the nights when she lay awake with one hand on her stomach and talked to the daughter she hadn't met yet, telling her about her father, trying to hold the shape of him in words before grief could blur the edges. She had kept breathing right up until tonight. Gerald Ashford had called her into his study at 8 o'clock. The room smelled like bourbon and old wood and the particular kind of certainty that comes from never having been told no. He had sat behind his desk with his hands folded and his face arranged into something that was not quite an expression, and he had told her in the measured tone of a man who considers himself reasonable that it was time to discuss practical matters. The document he slid across the desk was 6 pages long. Claire had read every word. What it said, stripped of the legal language, was this sign over primary custody decisions for her unborn daughter to the Ashford family move into the apartment building they owned on Cavendish Street, accept a monthly payment that would cover her expenses, and agree to raise her child under guidelines the family would provide. For supervision, Gerald had called it. Claire had looked up from the document and across the desk at the man who had been her father-in-law for 3 years, and she had said very clearly and without raising her voice, no. What followed was not a conversation. Diane Ashford had appeared in the doorway within minutes, her face flushed with the grief that had curdled somewhere over the past 4 months into something uglier. She had said things Claire was not going to repeat, not even in her own mind, not tonight. Secure
security had been called. Her suitcase, the one she'd packed in 4 minutes, grabbing things without looking, just grabbing, had been brought to the front door. Her keys had been thrown after her as she walked to her car.
Not handed, thrown. She had not looked back. Now she drove north on Route 9 with the rain hammering the roof of her 8-year-old Subaru, and her daughter kicking steadily against her ribs as if registering protest on behalf of them both, and she tried to think about where she was going instead of what she was leaving. The answer was the only place left: her grandfather's house on Hollow Road. Henry Weston had been dead for 5 years, and his house had been sitting empty on a dirt road outside the town of Garfield, Vermont, for all 5 of those years. Claire hadn't been back since the funeral. She told herself it was the distance, and then she told herself it was the timing. And somewhere in the 3rd year, she stopped telling herself anything and simply didn't go. The truth was simpler and harder than any excuse she'd made. The house was Henry, and Henry was gone, and walking back into that place felt like pressing a bruise she wasn't ready to press. Henry Weston had been her person. Not in a complicated way, not in a way that required explanation. He had simply been the fixed point around which her childhood had organized itself. Her parents had divorced when she was 6 and remarried other people and moved to other cities and done the things that adults do when they decide their first life wasn't quite right. And Henry had been the constant: the farmhouse every summer, the chess games by the fireplace.
The patient explanations of how things worked, delivered with the particular pleasure of a man who genuinely believed that understanding the world was one of the great gifts available to a human being.
He had been a self-taught engineer. He had read everything. He had built things with his hands and his mind, and he had tried to teach Claire to do the same, and she thought now, driving through the rain, that everything useful she knew about systems, about logic, about the satisfaction of solving a problem that resists you had come from those summers on Hollow Road. She had been 27 when he died.
The official cause of death was cardiac arrest.
He had been found in his garden at 7:42 in the morning by a neighbor who had come by to return a book. His pocket watch, the antique one he carried every day and wound every morning, the one engraved with his initials on the case, had stopped at exactly that time, as if even the objects around him had agreed to mark the moment. Everyone had called it peaceful, a good death for a good man. Claire had believed them. She believed them for 5 years. The turn onto Hollow Road came up faster than she expected, and she almost missed it. The sign half hidden by a pine branch that had grown over the post during the years she'd been away. She turned and felt the road change beneath her tires, pavement giving way to gravel, the smooth certainty of the highway replaced by something older and less predictable.
The headlights swept across familiar shapes, the stone wall that ran along the left side of the road,
The gap where the gate used to be before a storm took it down in 2009, the field where Henry had once tried to grow tomatoes with modest success and great enthusiasm. And then the house.
It sat at the end of a long gravel drive, the Victorian frame dark against the November sky, its windows black, its porch slightly uneven,
where the left side had settled over the years. The maple tree Henry had planted the year he bought the property stood in the front yard, enormous, now its branches stripped bare by October. The garden had gone wild without him, not ruined exactly, but returned to a kind of honest disorder that felt appropriate for a place that had been waiting. Claire sat in the car for a long moment with the engine running and the rain coming down and her daughter pressing insistently against her ribs. She thought about every other option available to her. She counted them carefully. When she was done counting, she got out of the car.
The spare key was under the river rock by the garden bed on the east side of the porch.
It had always been under the river rock. Henry believed that the point of a spare key was for it to be findable when you needed it, not hidden so well that it became useless. This had seemed to Claire when she was 12 like the most reasonable thing she'd ever heard an adult say.
She crouched down,
Not easy at 8 months, and turned the rock over, and there it was, cold and waiting exactly where it had always been. She stood up and looked at it in her palm for a moment. Then she went to the door. The lock turned smoothly. The door swung inward. She reached for the light switch out of pure muscle memory, not expecting anything, and the hall light came on. Claire stood very still.
She had assumed the power would be off.
5 years empty, nobody paying the bill. It should have been dark and cold and dead. Instead, the hall light was on, casting a warm yellow glow across the entryway, and she could feel faintly the movement of heated air coming from somewhere deeper in the house. She stepped inside and listened. The house was quiet, but it was the quiet of a place that was breathing, not the silence of a place that had stopped.
She moved down the hallway to the kitchen. The room was dark until she reached for the switch and the overhead light came on, and she saw the kitchen exactly as she remembered it. The same table, the same chairs, the cast iron pan hanging on the wall. The bookshelf of paperbacks Henry kept in the kitchen because he believed reading should be available in every room of a house. The surfaces were dusty but not neglected. The refrigerator stood unplugged and open,
which was sensible for a long vacancy. The dish rack on the counter held 2 plates and a mug, dried and waiting, and on the kitchen table in the center, a white envelope. Claire crossed the room and stood over it without touching it. Her name was on the front, written in Henry's handwriting, the precise, deliberate script of a man who
Had learned penmanship before it stopped being taught and had never unlearned it. Not Claire Matthews, not Mrs. Ashford. Claire Weston.
She picked it up. She turned it over. The flap was sealed. She set it back down on the table and stepped back from it and pressed one hand against the wall and breathed. Her daughter kicked. "I know," Claire said out loud. "Give me a minute." She stood in her grandfather's kitchen in the dark of a November night and gave herself 60 seconds to feel the full weight of everything. The eviction, the drive, the rain, the envelope, the 5 years, the grief she had packed into a box and refused to open because there had always been something more urgent, something that needed her to be functional. And then she straightened up and wiped her face with the back of her hand and went to put the kettle on.
She would read the letter when she had tea.
Henry would have approved of that. She slept on the living room couch that night, too tired to make up the beds upstairs, too unsettled to sleep in Henry's room. She pulled a quilt from the closet, the patchwork one her grandmother had made, still folded exactly where it had always been, and lay down and listened to the house breathe around her. She did not open the envelope. Not that night. The knock came at 6:15 in the morning.
Claire was awake.
She had been awake since 5, lying on the couch, watching the November light come up through the kitchen window, thinking about the envelope on the table and the locked front gate of the Ashford estate, and the sound of keys hitting the gravel behind her. The knock was firm and unhurried, the knock of someone who had been expecting to use it. She went to the door and looked through the side window.
An old man stood on the porch holding a covered dish and a thermos.
He was perhaps 75 or 76 broad through the shoulders, in the way of men who were once very strong and have lost very little of it, with a face weathered to the color of oak, and eyes that were pale and direct. He wore a canvas jacket and work boots, and he was completely dry despite the fact that it was still raining. He had an umbrella, but he hadn't bothered to open it. Claire opened the door.
"You must be Claire,"
the man said. "I'm Arlo Beckett. I live about a quarter mile down the road. I've been watching the property since Henry passed." He looked at her with those pale, direct eyes. "I figured you'd show up eventually." Henry figured the same. He held up the covered dish. "I brought eggs and biscuits. You look like you haven't eaten since yesterday." She hadn't. She opened the door wider.
Arlo Beckett had been a civil engineer for 35 years before he retired to Vermont and bought a property on Hollow Road,
because as he explained it, he had spent his career building things in cities and he wanted to spend the second half of his life somewhere. He could see what he'd built from his front porch without needing to drive 40 minutes to get to it. I had met Henry Weston in the spring of 2003 over a property line dispute that turned out, upon investigation, to be the result of a surveying error from 1987 and was entirely the fault of neither party. They had resolved it in a single afternoon over Henry's kitchen table, and had been friends from that day until the morning Henry died. Arlo had been the neighbor who found him in the garden. He told Claire this without ceremony, setting a plate of eggs in front of her and sitting across the table with his coffee, and she understood that he was the kind of man who believed in saying true things plainly, because clarity was a form of respect.
I was face down in the herb bed,
Arlo said. His watch had stopped. I called 911 and then I sat with him until they came because I didn't think he should be alone. He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. The doctors said cardiac arrest. Henry was 73 years old and he appeared healthy, but he was 73 years old and sometimes hearts stop. That's what they said. He looked at Claire. I never believed it, he said. Not for a single day.
Claire set down her fork. Why not? Because 3 days before he died, Henry sat in this kitchen and told me something. Arlo set down his coffee. He said, if anything happens to me and Claire comes back to this house, you stand next to her. You don't leave her alone. Whatever she finds, whatever comes next, you stand next to her. He paused. I asked him what he meant. He said he hoped I'd never need to find out. Another pause. I've been waiting 5 years. The kitchen was quiet, except for the rain on the roof and the low sound of the wind against the windows. Claire looked at the envelope on the table. She had been avoiding it since last night. She picked it up, broke the seal, and read what was inside. It was not a long letter. It was a postcard old paper, the kind of stock they stopped making sometime in the 70s, with a faded photograph of a lighthouse on the Maine coast on one side. On the other side, in Henry's precise handwriting, the answer is always in the music, Claire Bear. When you're ready, call Edmund Thorne, Burlington. He has been waiting longer than Arlo. I am sorry for the distance. I am not sorry for the reason. H. Beneath it, in smaller letters, a name, a street address, and a phone number. Claire read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket and looked at Arlo across the table. Who is Edmund Thorne? She asked. Henry's lawyer, Arlo said. Has been for 40 years. He picked up his coffee. Whatever Henry left you, that's where it is. Edmund Thorne's office occupied the second floor of a brick building on Church Street in Burlington, a building that had been standing since 1887 and showed no signs of reconsidering this position. The brass plaque beside the door was new enough to still be bright. The building around it was not. Thorne himself was 68 years old, with the careful stillness of a man who had heard a great many things he was not supposed to hear, and had learned to hold them without expression. He rose when Claire entered, shook her hand, and looked at her with the steady attention of someone making an assessment they have been preparing for a long time. You look like him, he said. The eyes especially. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Claire sat. He opened a file that had been sitting, she noticed already open on the desk before she arrived, as if he had taken it out this morning in expectation. I need to explain something before we begin, Thorne said. What you are about to hear is going to be difficult to process. I would ask you to hold your questions until I have finished, and then I will answer everything I can. Claire nodded. The first thing you need to know, Thorne said, is that the legal situation surrounding this property is not what you have been told. He paused to let that settle. For the past 5 years, it has been publicly represented through carefully managed documentation that Henry Weston's estate
was tied up in a complex legal dispute involving outstanding liabilities and contested claims on the property. This representation was false. Henry created it deliberately. The estate has never been in dispute. There are no outstanding liabilities. The property and everything in it have been yours legally and completely since the moment Henry died.
Claire opened her mouth. Thorne held up one hand. Please. She closed her mouth.
Henry created the appearance of a legal encumbrance for a specific reason, Thorne continued. He needed the property to appear inaccessible and unresolved, so that certain parties would have no legal basis to act against it, and no profitable reason to force a resolution. The moment you assert ownership, the fiction ends, which means the moment you walked into that house last night, which I believe you did, because the system notified me the situation changed. What system? Claire said.
Thorne allowed the question.
The house has a biometric security system built into the entry points. It has been running on backup power for 5 years waiting. When you used the key last night, it read your fingerprints against Henry's stored profile. The match triggered the ownership transfer and sent a notification to this office. He folded his hands. Henry built it himself. It is like most things Henry built, considerably more sophisticated than it appears.
Claire sat with that for a moment. What did he leave me? She asked. Thorne looked at her steadily. He left you the house, he said.
The land, the workshop. A pause. And something Henry called the Weston Protocol. 40 years of research into quantum energy conversion. A working prototype device the size of a thermos that can generate continuous electrical power indefinitely, without fuel, without emissions, and without any of the infrastructure that the current energy industry depends on. He paused again. 1 unit scaled appropriately can power an entire city block indefinitely.
The room was very quiet. Henry completed the working prototype in 2011, Thorne continued. He spent the last 7 years of his life securing it, documenting it, and preparing for exactly this moment. He looked at Claire. Hargrove Energy has known about Henry's research since 1974. They have been waiting for an opportunity to acquire it. Your grandfather spent 50 years making sure that opportunity never came. Another pause. You are now the single legal owner of the most valuable piece of undisclosed technology in the world. Claire looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the envelope on the kitchen table, the postcard. The answer is always in the music. She thought about the house that had been breathing last night when it should have been cold and dark. She thought about her daughter pressing steadily against her ribs, entirely unaware of and apparently unbothered by the nature of her inheritance. You said certain parties would have no basis to act, Claire said. Past tense. Yes, Thorne said. Meaning they do now?
Yes. How long do I have before they move? Thorne glanced at his watch. It was a precise economical gesture. Victor Hargrove has a monitoring service on the property records, he said. The ownership transfer processed this morning at 6:47 a.m. He will know by now. He looked up. I would estimate you have until this afternoon. She drove back to Hollow Road in the kind of pale November light that makes everything look simultaneously clear and cold, and she was halfway up the gravel drive when she saw the black Escalade parked at the edge of the road. Not on the property, exactly at the line.
A man stood beside it.
He was perhaps 75 years old. He was wearing a gray suit that cost more than most people's cars, and he was standing in the cold November air without an overcoat. And this detail struck Claire as
The most revealing thing about him, the absolute refusal to be inconvenienced by weather or by anything else. She parked and got out. The man walked to meet her at the foot of the drive. He moved like someone who had never once in his life crossed a room toward another person and believed himself to be at a disadvantage in doing so.
Claire Weston, he said. I'm Victor Hargrove. I believe you've heard my name this morning. I have, Claire said. He looked at her with the measured attention of a man conducting an evaluation. His eyes were dark and steady and entirely without warmth. I was a friend of your grandfather's, he said. A long time ago. I have a great deal of respect for what Henry built. That respect is what brings me here rather than a lawyer. He paused. I'd like to make you an offer for the property.
$6 million. Cash. You could close in 30 days.
No, Claire said. 8 million, he said without blinking. I'm prepared to go higher.
Mr. Hargrove, Claire said.
I'm going to say no at every number. I want to be honest with you about that so you don't waste your morning. Something moved behind his eyes, not anger, something cooler and more patient than anger. 10 million, he said. Final. No. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her stomach very briefly in a way that was not quite a threat and was not quite anything else, and then he looked back at her face.
I knew your grandfather for a long time, he said. He was a brilliant man, a genuinely brilliant man.
A pause. He was also a man who made very consequential decisions without fully understanding the weight of what he was protecting. I hope you'll think carefully before making the same error. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card, holding it out to her. My personal number, if you change your mind. Claire did not take the card.
After a moment, Hargrove set it on the hood of her car and walked back to the Escalade. Before he got in, he turned. Henry's last physical was in February of 2018, he said. His heart was in excellent condition. I know because I have the records. He held her gaze for one precise second. Something to think about. The Escalade pulled away. Claire stood in the gravel drive and watched it go. Then she picked up his card from the hood of her car and went inside. She found the entrance to the basement workshop in exactly the place it should not have been.
Henry had told her when she was 10 years old that the house had a root cellar. He had shown it to her, a low-ceilinged space under the kitchen accessed through a trapdoor in the pantry floor smelling of earth and old wood. She had gone down there twice as a child and found it exactly as described: root vegetables in crates, mason jars on shelves, nothing remarkable.
She went back to it now, and she stood in the pantry and looked at the trapdoor, and she thought about Henry and about the house that was breathing when it should have been dead. And she lifted the trapdoor and went down the wooden steps. The root cellar was as she remembered it. Low ceiling, earth smell, shelf of mason jars, crates. She stood in the center of the space and turned slowly. The north wall was stone. Old fieldstone mortared together sometime in the 19th century. She moved toward it and pressed her palm flat against the surface and felt nothing. Cold stone. Nothing else. She thought about Henry. She thought about the way he taught her things, always sideways, always through the problem rather than around it. Never here is the answer. Always here is the shape of the question. She thought about the postcard. The answer is always in the music. She looked at the stones.
She thought about the Fibonacci sequence, the one Henry had taught her when she was 9, sitting at the kitchen table, tapping the numbers out on the wood. 2, 3, 13. Everything that grows follows this pattern. Pattern, Claire Bear, shells, flowers, rivers. If you know the pattern, you can find the structure in anything. She pressed the stones. First stone, second stone, third, fifth, eighth. The wall did not move.
She tried the sequence differently, not position but pressure, not the stones themselves, but the
mortar lines between them. She pressed at the intersections in the sequence pattern and felt on the 8th press. A faint give not, mechanical, not dramatic, just the suggestion of movement, like something releasing a breath it had been holding. A section of the wall, perhaps 3 feet wide from floor to ceiling, swung inward on a pivot she could not see.
Beyond it, A corridor. Concrete floor, low ceiling, electrical conduit running along the wall, and at the far end 50 feet away, a steel door with a keypad and a handprint scanner mounted beside it. The corridor lights were already on. Claire stood at the threshold for a long moment. Then she went through. The handprint scanner read her palm and confirmed the DNA match in 11 seconds. She knew somewhere in the part of her mind that was still processing what Thorne had told her that Henry had built this too, had stored her genetic profile here, had set this system to recognize her, and only her had done all of this years ago against exactly this moment. The door opened. She stepped through and stood very still and tried to take in what she was looking at. The laboratory was larger than the house above it. It occupied a space that must have taken 20 years to excavate and build a cavernous underground room with a concrete ceiling 12 feet overhead. The walls lined with workbenches and equipment and shelving cables and conduit, running in neat bundles along every surface. The lighting was fluorescent, bright, and utterly clean. The air was fresh, circulated by a ventilation system she could hear running somewhere in the walls. In the center of the room stood a device. It was smaller than she expected. A cylinder perhaps 10 inches tall and 4 inches across, mounted on a base unit roughly the size of a car battery, all of it brushed titanium. A section of the cylinder's housing was transparent, and through it she could see internal components she didn't have the vocabulary to name. From the core of the device, a faint blue light pulsed with a rhythm that was slow and perfectly even. It had been running unattended for 5 years. Beside the device on the workbench, a monitor had activated. On it, a simple video player interface, a file ready to play, and beneath the screen, a handwritten index card taped to the bench in Henry's handwriting for Claire. When you're ready. She sat down on the workbench stool. She pressed play. Henry appeared on the screen. I was older than she remembered. Not the Henry of her childhood, but the Henry of his last years, his face deeply lined, his white hair thinner. His eyes were the same. That particular shade of gray-blue, the kind of eyes that seemed to be measuring things even when the rest of the face was at rest. He looked directly at the camera as if he could see her sitting there. "Claire," he said, "if you're watching this, then you came back. I knew you would. I built this for you, but I also built it for the day when you would need it. And I am sorry that those two things turned out to be the same day." He paused. "I need to tell you what this device is, and I need to tell you what it cost." His hands were folded in his lap. She recognized the gesture. He had always folded his hands that way before he said something important. "In 1974, he said, a young man named Victor Hargrove approached me with funding for my research. I was 30 years old. I had been working on energy conversion theory for 6 years with no resources and no support. Hargrove was 26 years old and already running the investment division of a company that would become Hargrove Energy. He understood even then what this technology could mean. I believed he understood it the way I understood it, as a gift to the world. I was wrong." He looked at his hands for a moment. "When the first prototype worked, truly worked beyond anything I had projected, Hargrove showed me what he actually wanted. Not clean energy for the world, a monopoly on it, and beyond that, a weaponized version. The conversion process reversed becomes an extraction process. It can drain energy from any system, any system." His voice was steady and flat, including living tissue. The lab was very quiet. "I refused," Henry said. "I told him I was done. I packed my research and I tried to leave." He paused. "They didn't let me leave. I was held in a secured facility in western Pennsylvania for 3 years.
They called it a research compound. I called it what it was. He looked up at the camera again.
I built a flaw into every prototype they tried to replicate, a fundamental constraint in the conversion matrix that makes weaponization impossible without a specific biological key, my biological key, my DNA sequence. A pause. Yours as my blood descendant. Your daughters as yours. He looked directly at the lens. That is why they need you, Claire. Not just the device, you. The key is in your blood. Claire put her hand on her stomach. I escaped in the winter of 1977, Henry continued. I came to Vermont, I built this house, and then I built this room, and I spent the rest of my life finishing what I started and making sure it would survive me. He paused. I also spent the rest of my life collecting evidence of what Hargrove did, and what Hargrove has done since the politicians purchased the patents, buried the scientists who got too close and then had accidents. His voice did not change when he said this. It stayed flat and measured. There is a file on the workbench to your left, a red folder. It contains 40 years of documentation. It is enough to end Hargrove Energy entirely if it reaches the right people. He looked at the camera one more time. There is one more thing, he said, the most important thing. He paused for a long moment. I believe Thomas did not die accidentally. Claire stopped breathing. 3 weeks before his death, Thomas contacted me. He had found something evidence of a financial relationship between his father and Victor Hargrove going back 15 years. He was going to report it. I told him to be careful. I told him to come to Vermont. Henry's voice did not waver. He told me he wasn't leaving you. That was the last time we spoke. He looked at his folded hands. I have no proof, he said. Only what I know about these men and what I know about how they protect themselves. A pause. But you should know. You should know who you are dealing with. He looked up one final time directly into the lens, directly at Claire. The house will protect you as long as you're inside it, he said. The system will have alerted certain people the moment you entered the lab, people I trust who have been waiting. Edmund Thorne knows who they are. Arlo Beckett will stand with you. A pause. Whatever you decide to do with what I've left you, Claire, I have only one instruction. Do not decide under pressure. Do not decide afraid. He almost smiled. You were always the brightest thing, he said. I am sorry I could not tell you any of this while I was alive. I hope you can forgive a stubborn old man who loved you more than he knew how to say. The video ended. The screen went dark. Claire sat in the underground laboratory her grandfather had built over 20 years in absolute secret, and she listened to the device beside her pulse with its steady blue light, and she breathed. Then she reached for the red folder. The red folder was 3 inches thick. Claire sat at the workbench in the underground laboratory and read it for 2 hours while the Meridian device pulsed its quiet blue light beside her, and the ventilation system breathed steadily through the walls, and the world above continued its business without her. The folder was organized the way Henry organized everything, by date, by category, by chain of consequence. It began in 1974 and it ended in 2017, the year before he died, and it documented 50 years of methodical wrongdoing with the precision of a man who understood that evidence without structure is just noise. Bank records, intercepted correspondence she did not ask herself yet how he had obtained it, photographs, copies of patent applications that had been filed and then quietly withdrawn, the names of 4 scientists who had worked on related energy research between 1980 and 2005 and had each died in circumstances that individually could be explained and together could not, and a section near the back tabbed in red that concerned Thomas,
She read that section twice.
It was not as Henry had said proof. It was the shape of proof, the outline of a relationship between Gerald Ashford and Hargrove Energy, going back to 2008, documented through a series of financial instruments that were legal on their face and explicable only in aggregate. Consulting fees paid to a shell company Gerald controlled. Board memberships at Hargrove subsidiaries. A pattern of investment in Hargrove Energy stock that preceded several key regulatory decisions by a margin too consistent to be coincidence. Thomas had found this. Thomas had called Henry 3 weeks before he died. And then Thomas had gone out on Route 17 on a wet night in August of 2020 and not come home. Claire closed the folder. She sat for a long time with her hand flat on the cover of it, and her daughter pressing steadily against her ribs in the blue light pulsing beside her, and she felt something shift in her chest, not breaking, not collapsing, but reorganizing, settling into a new configuration around a new understanding of what was true. She had spent 4 months grieving a man killed by an accident. She had been grieving the wrong thing. Arlo was in the kitchen when she came up from the cellar. He had made fresh coffee, and he had apparently also made a grocery run at some point during the morning because there was food in the refrigerator that hadn't been there before, and a casserole dish sitting on the counter covered with foil. He looked at her face when she came through the pantry, and he didn't say anything for a moment. He poured a mug of coffee and set it on the table and sat down across from where she would sit. She sat. She wrapped both hands around the mug. He told you, Arlo said. It was not a question. He left a video, Claire said, in the lab. I figured he would. Arlo looked at his own coffee. How much did he tell you? Everything, I think. She paused. About the device. About Hargrove. About being held. She stopped. About Thomas. Arlo was quiet for a moment. Henry told me about Thomas, he said. Not everything. Enough. He looked up at her. I'm sorry, Claire. I'm sorry you're finding out this way. Did you know when it happened? I suspected, Arlo said. Henry suspected. We didn't have proof then, and we don't have proof now. But when a healthy 34-year-old man goes off a straight road on a night with light rain and no other vehicles involved... He stopped. Some things don't need proof to be true, they just need to be handled correctly. Claire looked at him. What does correctly mean? It means you don't go at these people directly, Arlo said. Not without preparation, not without the right people standing with you. He wrapped his hands around his mug. Henry spent 30 years building the right people. That's what Thorne is going to explain to you next. That's what comes after the house. She spent the afternoon in the laboratory. She needed to understand what she had before she could decide what to do with it. And she had learned from Henry that understanding required time and direct engagement, not reading about a thing, not being told about a thing, but sitting with the thing itself until its logic became apparent. The Meridian device was operational. That much was obvious from the blue pulse from the monitoring system still running on the workbench from the readouts she could see on the adjacent screen, even without understanding all of what they said. She found Henry's operational notebooks in a cabinet beneath the main workbench, 12 of them numbered and dated, covering the period from 1979 to 2015. The handwriting was dense and technical, and in places she could not follow it, but she followed as much as she could. The core principle was not difficult to understand. What Henry had discovered, or rather what Henry had proven after 2 decades of theoretical work, was that ambient energy, the thermal and electromagnetic energy present in any environment at any temperature above absolute zero, could be converted into usable electrical power with nearly complete efficiency using a specific quantum resonance process, not generated, converted.
Henry had written in the first notebook in underlined letters was everything. We do not generate energy. We optimize the conversion of energy that already exists everywhere around us. There is no fuel because the fuel is the universe itself. There is no waste because the process is complete. There is no infrastructure dependency because the energy source cannot be owned, cornered, or controlled. That last sentence is why they want to stop it. She read that passage 3 times. She thought about Victor Hargrove standing in her gravel drive in his gray suit, refusing to be cold, offering her $10 million for a house and a device he could not use without her blood. She thought about Gerald Ashford and his consulting fees and his Hargrove stock, and his son who had found out and called Henry, and then gotten into a car on Route 17 and not come home. She thought about her daughter who would be born in 6 weeks into a world where this technology existed and was known and was either free or owned, and the difference between those two outcomes would determine what kind of her daughter inhabited for the rest of her life. She sat with the Meridian device and listened to it breathe. The knock at the front door came at 4:30 in the afternoon. Not Arlo's knock. Different rhythm. More deliberate. The knock of someone who has prepared what they are going to say on the other side of the door and is ready to say it. Claire came upstairs and looked through the side window. 2 men, both in dark coats. The one in front was perhaps 45 medium height, with the particular blankness of someone trained to project no readable expression. The one behind him was older, heavier, standing slightly back into the side in a way that was not casual. Not police. The stance was wrong for police. The coats were wrong. Private security. She did not open the door. "Miss Weston," the man in front said loud enough to carry. "My name is Phillips. I work for Hargrove Energy. Mr. Hargrove asked me to follow up on this morning's conversation." Claire said nothing. "We understand you may have some concerns about the property," Phillips continued. "Mr. Hargrove would like to address those concerns directly. He's prepared to meet at a location of your choosing." Still nothing from Claire. A pause from Phillips. "Miss Weston, it would be in everyone's interest to resolve this matter before it becomes complicated." Another pause. "Particularly given your current circumstances." She heard Arlo's voice from the kitchen behind her, low, directed at his phone. She couldn't make out the words. She turned and he was standing in the kitchen doorway, his phone to his ear, watching her with those pale eyes. And he gave her a small nod that meant, "I'm handling something, keep them occupied." "I'll relay your message to my attorney," Claire said through the door. "Of course," Phillips said. "We'll be in the area." The 2 men walked back to a black SUV parked at the foot of the drive. They did not leave. They sat in the SUV with the engine running. Claire went to the kitchen. "That was Thorne," Arlo said, pocketing his phone. "He's been trying to reach you. He says his office may have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "He's not certain, but something about the timing, Hargrove knowing you were at his office this morning before you'd told anyone. He thinks there may be a leak." Arlo looked at the front of the house where the SUV was still visible through the window. "He wants to see you tonight. Not at the office. Somewhere private. His office has been compromised." "He doesn't know. He suspects." Arlo pulled on his canvas jacket. "I know a back way off this property that doesn't go past the road. Takes about 20 minutes on foot through the East Field and out through the Pendleton land." He looked at her stomach. "Can you manage 20 minutes on uneven ground?" "I can manage 20 minutes," Claire said. They went out through the back of the house as the light was failing through the kitchen garden and the old fence line and into the East Field where the November grass was flattened and silver with cold. Arlo moved ahead of her, choosing the flattest line through the field without being asked, and Claire followed him and did not look back at the house until they were through the tree line.
and she could no longer see it.
Thorne met them at a farmhouse 4 miles down the road, a property belonging to his younger sister, he explained, unused since summer, connected to no record that linked back to him in any search that Hargrove's people were likely to run.
The farmhouse was cold. Thorne had arrived minutes before them and had not yet turned on the heat.
He was standing in the kitchen with his coat on a legal pad in his hand, and the expression of a man who has been holding a difficult piece of information for too long and is ready to set it down. "Prentice Doyle," he said before either of them had taken off their coats. Claire looked at him.
"My assistant,"
Thorne said. "He has been with my office for 12 years. He has access to every file, every communication, every client matter that passes through my practice." He set the legal pad on the table. "This morning, after you left, I received a call from a contact of mine at a title company in Burlington. They had received an inquiry automated through a monitoring service about the Weston property triggered by this morning's ownership transfer. Standard enough.
but the inquiry had been flagged with a priority code that my contact recognized.
Hargrove Energy uses that code for matters requiring immediate executive attention."
He paused.
"The monitoring service was notified of the transfer at 6:47 this morning. That notification is automatic, and I could not have prevented it. But the inquiry was routed with specific detail: your name, your connection to Henry, the fact that you had visited my office that was not in the public transfer record. That information could only have come from someone in my office." "Doyle," Arlo said.
"Almost certainly."
Thorne sat down. "I have not confronted him. I don't want to move him until we're ready. But it means that everything I know Hargrove knows. And it means we need to operate on the assumption that we've been monitored since the moment Claire arrived in Vermont." The kitchen was quiet. "Henry warned me," Claire said. "He wrote it in his journal. He said someone in your office had been feeding information to Hargrove for years."
Thorne looked at her steadily.
"Henry told you this. He left it in his notes." She paused. "He said to trust you, not anyone around you." Thorne absorbed this without visible reaction. Then he looked down at his legal pad.
"There is someone coming,"
he said. "Someone Henry trusted above almost everyone. She's been notified that you've returned. She's driving in from Cambridge tonight." He looked up. "Her name is Dr. Constance Ellery. She was Henry's colleague, his closest colleague before 1974, before everything changed." He paused. "I should warn you. What she knows about your grandfather, what she'll tell you, goes beyond what Henry was able to put it in any document." "What does she know?" Claire asked.
Thorne was quiet for a moment.
"About what Hargrove did to him," he said, "during those 3 years. Dr. Constance Ellery arrived at the farmhouse at 11 o'clock that night.
She was 70 years old,
and she moved with the deliberate economy of someone who has learned not to waste energy on anything that doesn't require it. Her hair was white and cut close, and her eyes behind her glasses were the dark, precise eyes of a scientist, the kind that look at a thing and see its structure before they see its surface. She came through the door and she looked at Claire standing in the kitchen doorway, and she stopped for just a moment.
"Yes,"
she said quietly to no one in particular. "Yes, I see it." She set down her bag and came to the table and sat down. And she looked at Claire with that precise attention for a long moment without speaking. "He talked about you," she finally said, "right up until the point where he stopped talking about anything personal, which was sometime in 1977. A pause. Before that, he talked about you constantly. You were 4 or 5 years old. He was insufferable about it."
Despite everything, Claire almost smiled.
"How did you know him?" she asked. We were at MIT together, Constance said. I was in the physics department. Henry was in engineering, but he spent half his time in the physics building because he found the engineering department intellectually limiting, which was accurate but not a view he expressed with much tact. Something moved briefly in her expression. We worked together for 6 years, from 1968 to 1974. Were you... Claire stopped.
Engaged, Constance said.
For 2 years, before he disappeared. She said it plainly without drama. When he came back in 1977, he ended it. He said it wasn't safe. He said there were people watching him and anyone close to him would be in danger. She folded her hands on the table. I spent a long time being angry about that. It took me years to understand that he was right. She looked at Claire directly.
What Thorne tells me you found in that laboratory,
The scope of it, the completion of it. I've been waiting for this for 30 years. Henry and I have been in communication since 2001 very carefully through channels that Hargrove's monitoring couldn't reach. He updated me on the protocol's progress. He told me what he was building in Vermont. She paused. He also told me things he never put in any document. About what happened during those 3 years, Claire said. Yes.
a silence.
Tell me, Claire said. Constance was quiet for a moment.
What Henry told you in his video, the imprisonment, the forced research, the weaponization agenda,
That's accurate, she said. But there's more. She looked at the table. In 1975, the second year of his confinement, Hargrove implemented what they called a compliance protocol. The idea was to create a secondary biological key that Hargrove could control directly a person carrying the Weston DNA, who would be entirely under their authority. Claire felt something go cold in her chest.
They identified a female researcher at the facility.
Constance continued, her voice remaining even. A young woman named Sandra Voss. They orchestrated a situation. I will not describe the details in which a child was conceived. Henry was not a willing participant. He had no agency in this. She looked directly at Claire. The child was born in November of 1975 and taken immediately. Henry never saw him. The kitchen was absolutely silent.
The child was raised by Hargrove, Constance said. Not in his household, but under his supervision through a network of managed placement. The boy was educated, cultivated, shaped entirely according to Hargrove's design, given the name Nathan Voss after his mother, placed eventually in a career track that put him directly inside Hargrove Energy. She paused. Nathan Voss is currently
The chief science officer of Hargrove Energy, she said. He is 48 years old. He has spent his entire career working on energy systems for a company that he does not know was responsible for his conception and his existence. Another pause. He has never been told who his father was. Hargrove has always intended to use him as the biological key for weaponization if the primary line, you could not be secured. Claire looked at her hands on the table.
She thought about the video in the lab.
Henry's voice. Your daughter is the last lock. She thought about Nathan Voss, 48 years old, sitting somewhere inside Hargrove Energy's structure doing his work, not knowing. Does he know any of this? She asked.
No, Constance said.
I don't believe so. She paused. But I've been watching his work for several years. The papers he's published, the research directions he's pursued. There are patterns in it that suggest he has suspected something is wrong, not about himself, about the company, about the technology he's been told he's developing. She looked at Claire. He is Henry's son. Whatever Hargrove did to shape him, whatever they controlled the mind, is still his father's mind.
Claire sat with this for a long time. The heat had come on sometime in the past hour, and the farmhouse was warmer now, but she was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She thought about her daughter. She thought about what it meant to be born into something you didn't choose to inherit, a war that was already old when you arrived. She thought about Nathan Voss, 48 years old, in a building in Manhattan working on technology he'd been handed by a man who owned him. "How was in the video?" she said. Constance looked at her. "The security footage from my grandfather's house, the morning Henry died." Claire met her eyes. "A man came to the house at 6:15 in the morning. He had tea with Henry. He left at 7:20. Henry died at 7:42. She paused. "It was Nathan Voss." Constance was very still. "You're certain?" "I have the footage," Claire said. A long silence. "Then either Hargrove sent him," Constance said slowly, "or Nathan went on his own." She looked at the table. "And I am not certain which possibility concerns me more." They stayed at the farmhouse that night. Arlo slept in the chair by the door because he was the kind of man who did not need to be asked to do a thing like that. Thorne made calls from the back bedroom with the door closed, reaching the people Henry had identified in the red folder. The network built over 3 decades, the scientists and attorneys, and one sitting congresswoman who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Claire lay on the couch in the front room and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known 48 hours ago. Her grandfather had been imprisoned. He had been violated in the most fundamental ways a person can be violated. He had escaped and spent the rest of his life building a weapon against the people who had done it. Not a weapon of destruction, but a weapon of exposure, of truth, of technology, released into the world so freely that no one could own it. He had done all of this while being a grandfather, while teaching her chess, while making blueberry pancakes on summer mornings and explaining how engines worked and reading to her on the porch in the evenings. He had been carrying all of it the whole time. She pressed her hand against her daughter's movement in the dark. "His name was Henry," she said quietly. "He was the best person I've ever known, and he left you everything." In the morning, Thorne received a call from his office. Prentice Doyle had not come in. His desk had been cleared overnight. A review of his computer showed a systematic deletion of files not clean enough to be thorough, done in haste. The deletion pattern of someone who had decided very suddenly that it was time to stop being where he was. "He's running," Arlo said. "He's been told to run," Thorne said, "which means Hargrove knows we've identified him." He looked at Claire, "which means the timeline has accelerated." "How accelerated?" she asked. "I received a call this morning from a contact at the state police. A missing persons inquiry was filed yesterday evening, filed by Hargrove Energy's legal department." He paused. "For you." Claire stared at him. "You haven't been missing," she said. "I've been at my grandfather's house." Hargrove's legal team filed a welfare check request citing concern for an estranged family member in late pregnancy who had left her residence under emotional distress. His voice was flat and precise. "It's a legal mechanism. It creates a paper record of concern. It also creates a basis for intervention if someone were to determine that you were making decisions about valuable property while in a compromised mental state." He looked at her steadily. "It's not a criminal complaint. It's a setup." Claire looked at the table. She thought about the card Hargrove had left on the hood of her car, the way he had looked at her stomach, the way he had said something to think about before getting into his Escalade. She thought about what Constance had told her the night before, about Nathan Voss, about the compliance protocol,
about the specific systematic way in which Hargrove Energy treated human beings as instruments.
She had been patient because
Henry had told her not to decide under pressure, but there was a difference between patience and passivity. She looked up at Thorne. You said there's a congresswoman, she said, someone Henry trusted.
Janet Reevesy,
Thorne said. House Energy Committee. She's been a member of what Henry called the Trust for 9 years. She has a contact at the FBI, a division that has not been touched by Hargrove's influence, which narrows the field considerably but does not make it empty. He paused. She's been waiting for actionable evidence. The red folder is more than sufficient. Then we move, Claire said. Arlo looked at her. You said Henry told you not to decide under pressure, he said.
He told me not to decide afraid, she said. Those aren't the same thing. She stood up from the table.
Hargrove is trying to construct a legal framework that makes me look unstable, she said. He has a man who can unlock the device's secondary functions and doesn't know it yet. He has 50 years of practice making problems disappear. She looked at each of them in turn. We have the device, the evidence, the network Henry built, and the element of surprise which we lose if we wait. She put her hand on the table. What we don't have is leverage over Hargrove himself. His own words,
recorded on the record, admitting what he did to my grandfather
and what he did to Thomas. She paused. That's what we need, and the only way to get it is to make him believe he's already won.
The room was quiet.
Constance looked at her across the table with those precise measuring eyes. You sound like him, she said softly. I know, Claire said. I'm counting on it. Thorne reached Congresswoman Reeves that afternoon.
She did not require
convincing. She had been waiting, as Thorne had said, for something actionable in 40 years of documented evidence, plus a working prototype of the technology. Hargrove had suppressed constituted the most actionable thing she had seen in 9 years of waiting. She made 2 calls to her FBI contact and to a federal prosecutor in New York and called Thorne back within the hour. They could have a team in place at a location of Claire's choosing within 72 hours.
Claire requested 48. That night she went back to the house on Hollow Road. The black SUV was still parked at the foot of the drive. Different people inside it now, Hargrove's surveillance running in shifts. She walked past it without looking at it, and went up the porch steps and into the house and down through the pantry and into the corridor and through the steel door into the laboratory. She sat in front of the Meridian device for a long time. The blue light pulsed, steady, patient. She thought about what Henry had built, not just this device, not just this room, but the entire architecture of preparation he had constructed over 50 years. The network of allies, the evidence files, the biometric security, the video message, the postcard, the key under the river rock, all of it designed with the understanding that someday someone would come and need to be able to pick it up and carry it forward. He had built it all for her. She reached out and put her hand on the warm titanium surface of the device and felt the faint vibration of the conversion process running inside it. I've got it, Grandpa, she said. The blue light pulsed. She stayed there a while longer, her hand on the device, her daughter moving steadily inside her, the laboratory breathing around her in the dark of the Vermont night. Then she took her hand away and went back upstairs. There was work to do. The plan was built the way Henry would have built it. Not from the outside in, not from the dramatic confrontation backward to the preparation, but from the foundation up. Every element load-bearing, every contingency mapped. Nothing left to improvise that could be decided in advance. Thorne handled the legal architecture. Congresswoman Reeves handled the federal coordination.
Arlo handled the property and the physical security moving through the house and the laboratory with the quiet competence of a man who had spent 35 years solving structural problems and understood that the principles were the same whether you were building a bridge or protecting a person. Claire handled everything else.
She worked for 48 hours with 4 hours of sleep, and the particular focused clarity that arrives when a person stops being afraid of a thing and starts treating it as a problem to be solved. She read every document in the red folder until she could navigate its contents without looking. She studied the Meridian device's operational parameters until she understood not just what it did, but why the underlying logic of the conversion process. The elegant simplicity of the quantum resonance mechanism, the specific nature of the biological lock Henry had built into the weaponization pathway. She understood now with complete clarity why Hargrove needed her. The device in its current form was extraordinary. The clean energy applications alone represented a technology that would render the entire fossil fuel infrastructure obsolete within a generation. But the weaponized variant, the extraction mode that Henry had locked behind a biological key, required something no amount of money or engineering could replicate without the Weston bloodline. Victor Hargrove was 75 years old. He had been chasing this for 50 years, and now the key was standing in her grandfather's kitchen in Vermont, 8 months pregnant, reading his files. Claire thought about that. About what it must feel like to be Hargrove, to be that close, to have waited that long to be looking at the finish line. Men who feel that close to winning get careless, they talk. That was the plan. She called Hargrove's personal number on the morning of the second day. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had been waiting for the call. "Miss Weston," he said. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath the control, a tightness and alertness that he was managing carefully. "Mr. Hargrove," Claire said, "I've been thinking about your offer." A pause, measured. He was not going to give her anything until he understood what she was offering. "I'm listening," he said. "I want to meet," she said. "Just us. No lawyers, no security teams. I have questions that I want answered directly, and I have something to discuss that I'm not prepared to put through attorneys." She paused. "I think we both know the property is more complicated than a simple sale. I want to understand what I'm actually dealing with before I make any decisions." Another pause. Longer this time. "Where?" he said. "New York," she said. "Neutral ground. You're building your floor. I'm not asking you to come to me, but the meeting is between us." She could hear him thinking. "Tomorrow," he said. "Noon. Hargrove Tower, 38th floor." A pause. "Come alone." "I'll come alone," Claire said. She ended the call and set the phone on the kitchen table and looked at Arlo across the room. "He agreed too quickly," Arlo said. "Yes," Claire said, "he did. He's planning something." "He's planning to win," Claire said. "And men who are planning to win talk about winning. That's the whole point." She drove to New York the next morning. Thorne had arranged a hotel room the night before, paid in cash through a third party not connected to her name. She slept 5 hours, which was more than she expected, and ate breakfast in the hotel restaurant at 9 o'clock, and sat with her coffee and watched the city moving outside the window and thought about Henry. She thought about the postcard. The lighthouse on the Maine coast. The answer is always in the music. She had understood that line in the root cellar, the Fibonacci sequence, the stones, the mathematical pattern Henry had used as a key. But she thought now that it meant something more than that. Henry had believed that the deep structures of things, the underlying logic, the repeating patterns, were always visible if you knew how to look. Music was pattern made audible. Mathematics was pattern made precise.
A man's behavior repeated over 50 years was a pattern made inevitable.
Victor Hargrove had a pattern.
He had exhibited it consistently since 1974. Find the leverage, apply the pressure, secure the asset. He had done it to Henry. He had done it to the scientists in the red folder. He had done it through Gerald Ashford to Thomas. He would do it again today. And today, for the first time, the pattern was going to be recorded.
The recording device was built
into the lining of the support band she wore around her midsection, designed by a colleague of Constance's, a retired signals engineer who had spent 20 years doing work he did not discuss publicly. It was passive, requiring no activation, running continuously from the moment she put it on. The audio quality Constance's colleague had told her was sufficient to be admissible in federal court.
He had tested it in environments
considerably noisier than a corporate conference room.
Thorne and Arlo were in a room 3 floors below in the same building, a conference suite,
booked under a name, connected to none of them, with a direct audio feed running to Thorne's laptop and a phone line open to Congresswoman Reeves's office in Washington. The FBI team was in position outside the building.
The research files, the complete Weston protocol documentation, 40 years of Henry's work, the operational parameters of the Meridian device. The full technical specifications were on a server that Constance and 2 members of the trust had been loading for 36 hours. 42 academic journals, 11 investigative journalists, 3 regulatory agencies in 3 countries, and a standing open access
technology database were all queued to receive the complete package simultaneously at 1:30 p.m.
1 hour after the meeting began,
whether Claire was out of the room or not. The 38th floor of Hargrove Tower looked exactly like the exercise of power it was.
Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. Manhattan spread out below like a demonstration of scale.
Look how small everything is from here. Look how clearly you can see it all. Look what it means to be above it. The furniture was severe and expensive. The art on the walls was the art of a man who had been told what to buy by people who understood what such things communicate. Victor Hargrove was standing at the window when she was shown in.
He turned when she entered, and she saw him recalibrate something in his expression, shifting as he registered her in person. The pregnancy, the steadiness of her manner, the absence of the fear he had perhaps expected to find.
"Miss Weston," he said, "please."
He gestured to the chairs arranged around a low table near the window.
She sat. He sat across from her. Between them, nothing, no documents, no laptop, no visible preparation. He had come to this meeting as a man who kept everything in it, who had long since moved past the need for notes. A quality Claire thought that was going to be very useful in the next hour. "You said you had questions," Hargrove said.
"I do," Claire said.
"But first I want to tell you something so we understand each other." She met his eyes. "I've been in the laboratory. I've seen the device. I've read the research." She paused. "And I've watched the security footage from my grandfather's house on the morning he died." Something moved in Hargrove's expression, very controlled, very small. "I see," he said.
"So I know what we're actually discussing," Claire said. "Not a property sale, not a development deal.
You want the Meridian device, and you need my biological signature to unlock the secondary conversion pathway." She paused. "I want to understand why. Not the commercial rationale. I've read the documents. I understand the commercial rationale. I want to understand why a man who had a working clean energy device available to him chose to suppress it for 50 years instead of using it."
Hargrove looked at her for a long moment.
She could see him deciding. The calculation happening behind those dark eyes. How much to say, what to reveal, whether she was a problem to be managed or an asset to be secured. And she could see him decide with the confidence of a man who had been unchallenged
Clean energy is not a product, he said. It's a disruption. There's a fundamental difference that idealists like your grandfather never understood. He spoke with the measured ease of a man explaining something obvious to someone who should have understood it already. A technology that eliminates the need for fuel for infrastructure for the distribution networks that underpin the entire global energy economy. That's not progress. That's a catastrophic destabilization of systems that 2 billion people depend on for employment, for stability, for the basic functioning of their economies. Angi. So you suppressed it to protect people, Claire said.
I managed it, Hargrove said. There's a difference. He paused. Technology of this magnitude requires a controlled release, under appropriate oversight, with appropriate safeguards. Appropriate meaning profitable, Claire said.
He almost smiled.
Meaning sustainable. The research, the development, the deployment infrastructure, none of it is free. It requires capital. It requires control. He looked at her steadily. Your grandfather was a brilliant man who
understood energy physics and understood almost nothing about the world that energy physics operates in.
He understood enough to escape from the facility you held him in for 3 years, Claire said.
The almost smile did not change. Henry was an exceptional man.
He was your prisoner, Claire said, for 3 years, against his will. Henry was a research partner who became difficult, Hargrove said, and the smoothness of it, the absolute lack of shame in the euphemism, was more revealing than anger would have been. The arrangement was not ideal for either party. We resolved it. He escaped, Claire said. That's how it was resolved.
He made a choice, Hargrove said.
As you are about to make a choice. He leaned forward slightly.
I want to be direct with you, he said,
because I think you're a direct person and I respect that. He folded his hands. You have something I need. I have something you need. Security, legal protection, a future for your daughter that doesn't involve spending the next 20 years in litigation or worse. He paused. I'm offering you a partnership, not a sale. A partnership. Your biological authorization for the secondary conversion pathway in exchange for a stake in what follows. Financial security for 3 generations. A role if you want it in how the technology is deployed. Another pause. I'm not your enemy, Claire.
You held my grandfather against his will, she said. Your grandfather made choices that created a complicated situation.
You suppressed technology that could have addressed climate change for 50 years. I managed a responsible deployment timeline. You arranged for my husband to have a car accident on Route 17 in August of 2020. The room went very quiet. Hargrove looked at her.
For the first time since she had entered the room, she saw something unmanaged in his expression. Not panic, but a rapid, precise reassessment. The look of a man recalculating. That's a very serious allegation, he said. His voice had changed. Still controlled, but differently controlled, the control of maintenance rather than ease. Thomas found the financial relationship between Gerald Ashford and Hargrove Energy, Claire said. He called Henry 3 weeks before he died. He was going to report it to federal authorities. She kept her voice level. 2 weeks later, he was dead. The same Gerald Ashford who has received consulting fees through a shell company connected to Hargrove subsidiaries since 2008.
She paused. I have the records. Hargrove was silent for a long moment. Gerald Ashford made independent business decisions that I was not privy to, he said carefully.
Gerald Ashford is an investor and a board member of 3 Hargrove subsidiaries, Claire said.
He has been in regular contact with your office for 15 years. He knew about the Weston Protocol through his relationship with you. And when his son found evidence of that relationship and threatened to expose it, Thomas died.
She looked at him steadily. I'm not alleging. I'm telling you what happened. Hargrove looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at her stomach.
It was the same look he had given her in the gravel drive. Not quite a threat, not quite anything else, but the direction of his attention was unmistakable. You're going to want to think carefully, he said, about how you proceed from this point. You are 8 months pregnant alone in this city in a legal situation that is considerably more complicated than you may realize. The welfare inquiry that was filed on your behalf
Was filed by your legal department,
Claire said, to create a record suggesting I was mentally compromised. I know. A pause.
You are making accusations you cannot prove,
Hargrove said. His voice had gone flat, the social warmth entirely gone, now the performance stripped away. Against a man with 50 years of legal infrastructure and more resources than you can conceive of. With a daughter about to be born who is going to need stability, not a mother who has decided to make herself a target. I'm not making accusations, Claire said. I'm recording them. The door opened. Hargrove turned.
Nathan Voss walked in. He was 48 years old, and he had Henry's height and Henry's way of moving, deliberate, economical, the movement of someone who thinks before he acts. He had gray beginning at his temples and the particular look of a scientist who spends too much time indoors, and he was carrying a laptop under one arm and looking at Hargrove with an expression that Claire could not immediately read. Hargrove's posture shifted, not visibly to anyone not watching for it, but she was watching for it.
Nathan, Hargrove said, I didn't ask you to join us. No, Nathan said, you didn't. He looked at Claire. She looked back at him.
This was the man she had watched on the security footage walking into her grandfather's kitchen, drinking tea with Henry, leaving 20 minutes before Henry died.
She had prepared herself to feel anger at the sight of him. She had prepared herself to feel certainty. Instead, she felt something more complicated, which was what she felt every time she thought about what Constance had told her. This man did not know who he was.
Nathan set the laptop on the table and opened it.
He turned the screen to face Hargrove. I need you to look at this, he said. On the screen, a document, dense with technical specifications. Claire could see from where she sat that
it was a research file, a technical analysis of the Meridian device's secondary conversion pathway.
I've been running independent verification on the protocol data, Nathan said, still looking at Hargrove. The data you gave me, the data you've been giving me for 3 years, as the basis for my work on the secondary pathway. A pause. It's been modified, systematically. Someone has been altering the base parameters before sending them to my team. He looked at Hargrove steadily. We've been working from corrupted data. Every model, every simulation.
Every projection
I've produced for the past 3 years, all of it is wrong.
Hargrove said nothing.
Which means, Nathan continued, that you have the correct data and you have been deliberately keeping it from my team. Which means that either you don't trust me to work with accurate data, or he stopped. He looked at Hargrove with those steady eyes. Or the reason I can't make the secondary pathway work from your data is because the real activation mechanism isn't in the data at all. He looked at Claire.
Not at her face, at her hand on the table, the hand that had opened the Meridian device's vault that had been scanned by Henry's biometric system that carried the genetic sequence that was the actual key. Something crossed his face. He looked back at Hargrove. Why is she really here? He asked. Hargrove was very still. Nathan, he said, this isn't the time. I've been working for you for 19 years, Nathan said. I've produced research that has made this company...
He stopped. Tell me why she's here. Tell me what the biological key actually is. Tell me who she is. She's Henry Weston's granddaughter, Hargrove said.
I know that, Nathan said.
I've known that since yesterday. I went back through the protocol research from the beginning, the original data, the 1974 documentation. He looked at Hargrove, and something in his expression had shifted. Not anger yet, but the immediate disorienting precursor to anger, the moment when a person realizes they have been standing on ground they thought was solid. Henry Weston built a biological lock into the secondary pathway.
He encoded it into the
DNA sequence of his direct bloodline. A pause. The documentation from 1975 includes research into an alternative biological key source, a secondary bloodline. He looked at Hargrove with those steady gray eyes.
Sourced from the research facility in Pennsylvania. The room was absolutely silent.
Tell me, Nathan said. Tell me what happened at that facility in 1975.
Hargrove looked at him for a long moment, and then Claire watched him make the calculation.
The same calculation she had seen him make when she entered the room. The assessment of leverage of options, of what he could manage and how. He decided apparently that Nathan was a controlled variable, that this was a complication but not a crisis, that the situation was still manageable.
Your mother was a researcher at the facility, Hargrove said. He said it with the same smoothness he had applied to everything else, the tone of a man presenting an inconvenient but navigable fact. She participated in a research program. You were the result. I made sure you were taken care of. Taken care of, Nathan repeated. Educated, placed, given every advantage. My mother, Nathan said. His voice had gone very quiet. Who was my father? Hargrove was silent. Who, Nathan said again,
was my father? The silence stretched. Claire said quietly, his name was Henry Weston. Nathan turned to look at her. She held his gaze.
He didn't know about you, she said. He found out years later. He wrote about it.
She paused. He called it the thing he could not fix, the one wrong he had no way to right. She looked at Nathan steadily. You have his eyes, his way of thinking. I've read his notebooks, the way you approached the data corruption, the way you came into this room. That's him. Nathan stood very still.
She watched the ground shift under him, watched him feel it shifting, watched him make the choice, and it was a choice she could see him making. It could see him reaching for the thing that was true instead of the thing that was manageable. He looked at Hargrove. You built me, he said. You shaped everything, my education, my career, the company I work for, the research I've spent my life on.
His voice was still quiet, still controlled, but underneath it now was something that had not been there when he walked in. You designed me to be a tool, a backup key for a lock that belonged to someone else's family. Hargrove said nothing.
Everything I've done, Nathan said. Every paper, every model, every hour, all of it in service of a company that was using me as an instrument without my knowledge. He looked at the laptop on the table. For 19 years. He picked up the laptop. He looked at Hargrove one more time. You used me my entire life, he said. His voice was very flat and very clear. That ends now. He turned to Claire. I have a copy of the internal data, he said. The real data uncorrupted, and 3 years of communications from Hargrove's executive team regarding the protocol, procurement of regulatory decisions, payments to Gerald Ashford's shell company. He paused. I've been keeping it because something felt wrong, and I didn't know what. Now I know what. He set the laptop on the table and turned it to face her. Whatever you need, it's yours. The door opened. Congresswoman Reeves entered first, followed by 2 men in dark coats who moved with the particular purposeful efficiency of federal agents who know exactly what they are there to do.
Hargrove turned. He looked at the agents. He looked at Claire.
She watched him understand. Watched the full shape of it land, the recording device, the timing, the coordination, the fact that everything he had said in this room for the past hour had been transmitted in real time to a federal prosecutor's office 3 blocks away. 50 years of careful construction dismantled in 60 minutes.
Victor Hargrove, the lead agent said, "You are under arrest on charges of conspiracy, kidnapping, corporate espionage, obstruction of justice, and accessory to homicide. You have the right to remain silent." Hargrove looked at Claire one more time. She looked back at him and said nothing. The agents crossed the room, and then Claire felt it. Not the relief she had expected, not the catharsis. A pain low and deep spreading through her abdomen with a slow, unmistakable certainty.
She pressed her hand against the table.
Another one. Stronger. "Arlo," she said, and her voice came out surprisingly steady. He was already through the door. He had come up with Reeves standing just outside the room, and now he was beside her with his hand on her arm and his pale eyes on her face, reading her expression with the immediate competence of a man who has spent 76 years paying attention. "How far apart?" he said. "I don't know," she said. 3 minutes, maybe less.
"Okay," he said.
He was already moving one hand under her elbow, his voice completely level. "We're going to walk to the elevator now. Everything else is handled." She looked back over her shoulder at the room.
Hargrove was in handcuffs.
Nathan Voss was standing at the window, his laptop under his arm, looking at the city below with an expression she could not name. Congresswoman Reeves was on her phone. The lead agent was reading Hargrove his rights with the unhurried precision of a man who does this often enough that the words have not lost their meaning. "Come on," Arlo said. She went. Nora Henry Weston was born at 4:47 in the afternoon at Weill Cornell Medical Center on York Avenue in Manhattan.
6 pounds 11 ounces.
Dark hair, which she had from her father. Eyes that were in the first hours the indeterminate blue of all new babies, and would later settle into a gray blue that made Constance Ellery when she first saw them reach for the back of a chair. Claire held her daughter in the delivery room and felt the particular silence that arrives after a very long time of noise, not absence but depth. The world still moving, still demanding, still full of everything that needed to be done. But underneath it suddenly this weight, this warmth, this person who had been with her through all of it, through the rain and the drive and the laboratory and the gravel drive and the 38th floor. Pressing steadily against her ribs as if to say, "I'm here, keep going."
"Hello," Claire said.
Her voice came out rough. "I'm your mother." Nora opened her eyes. Arlo arrived first because Arlo had been in the waiting room and had not left it. He stood in the doorway of the recovery room with his canvas jacket and his pale eyes, and looked at Nora in Claire's arms with an expression Claire had not seen on his face before, unguarded, simply present, stripped of all the careful competence. "Henry would have," he started. He stopped. He tried again.
"She's beautiful," he said.
Thorne came next with the particular bearing of a man delivering good news he has been waiting a long time to deliver. Gerald Ashford had been arrested at his estate in Connecticut at 4:52 p.m., 5 minutes after Hargrove's arrest in Manhattan, coordinated by the same federal team. Prentice Doyle had been located at a hotel in Albany and taken into custody before midnight. The Weston Protocol research had gone out at 1:00 p.m. as scheduled to all 42 journals and 11 journalists simultaneously. By the time Nora was an hour old, 3 major universities had issued statements confirming that the documentation was authentic and the technology was viable. An energy policy researcher at Stanford told a reporter that the papers represented the most significant scientific disclosure in 50 years. Hargrove Energy's stock had lost 60% of its value by market close. Constance Ellery arrived in the evening, and she stood at the edge of the room and looked at Nora and said nothing for a long time. "She has his eyes," she finally said. "Your grandfather, that same gray-blue." "I know," Claire said. Constance sat down in the chair beside the bed, and they were quiet together for a while, and the quiet was the comfortable kind, the kind that comes after things have been said and done and the need to fill space with words has passed. "Nathan Voss called me," Constance said eventually, "this afternoon." Claire looked at her. "I wanted to know about Henry," Constance said. "What he was like, what he cared about." She paused. "I talked to him for 2 hours. He asked very precise questions, the kind of questions a scientist asks, not a son. But underneath them," she stopped. "He's trying to understand who he is. It's going to take time." "He saved everything today," Claire said. "Whatever he was before, whatever Hargrove made him, he chose." "Yes," Constance said. "He did." She looked at Nora. "Henry would have found that significant. He believed that character was the choice you made when everything else fell away." 6 months later, the house on Hollow Road was breathing differently. Not the quiet breath of a place waiting, the active breath of a place in use. Cars in the drive, voices in the rooms, the smell of coffee at 7 in the morning, and the sound of work and conversation in the spaces Henry had built for exactly this purpose. The Henry Weston Foundation had been established in February, funded in part by the settlement from Hargrove Energy's court-ordered asset liquidation, and in part by a consortium of universities and research institutions that had spent 6 months trying to figure out how to adequately express their interest in what Henry had built. The Foundation's mandate was the one Henry had always intended for his work: free and open development of the Meridian technology, available to any qualified researcher, unencumbered by patent restriction or commercial interest. The laboratory beneath the house had been expanded, not altered. Claire had been precise about that, adamant, in a way that surprised no one who had listened to her grandfather's video. The original space was preserved intact, the workbenches and notebooks and the Meridian device itself, exactly where Henry had placed them, documented and protected as the origin of everything that came after. But beyond the original space, extending through new excavation under the East Field, 3 additional research bays now housed the Foundation's first cohort of fellows, 6 researchers selected from a pool of 400 applicants chosen by a committee that Constance chaired and that included, at Claire's insistence, Nathan Voss. Nathan had spent the first 2 months after his father's arrest in what Constance described to Claire as a kind of controlled reconstruction. He had resigned from Hargrove Energy the day of the arrest. He had spent 6 weeks going through this documentation, his own records, the red folder, the communications that had been entered into evidence, methodically reading the history of his own creation. He had called Claire twice during that period. Both times the conversations had been short and careful and had not addressed the thing they were both aware of until the second call, when he had said quietly, "Henry knew about me." "Yes," Claire had said, "and he couldn't." "No," Claire said. "He couldn't reach you without Hargrove knowing. He was afraid of what Hargrove would do." A long silence. "I was right to be afraid," Nathan said. He paused. I don't know what I am in relation to you. I don't know if there's a word for it." "Uncle," Claire said. "The word is uncle." Another silence. "I'd like to meet her," he said. "When you're ready, when it makes sense." "Come to Vermont in the spring," Claire said. He had come in April on a Tuesday, and Arlo had made coffee, and Constance had driven up from Cambridge, and they had sat around Henry's kitchen table, the same table where Claire had found the envelope, where Arlo had brought eggs and biscuits on a cold November morning, where everything had begun. and they had talked for most of the day about Henry and about the work and about what came next.
Nathan had held Nora for 20 minutes, and she had looked up at him with those gray blue eyes and grabbed his finger with her whole fist, and he had looked at her with an expression that Claire recognized from somewhere and then placed it was the expression in Henry's video, the last few seconds before the screen went dark, when Henry had looked directly at the camera as if he could see through it to the moment that was coming. The expression of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and can feel it beginning finally to be shared.
On the last evening of June, Claire sat on the porch of the house on Hollow Road with Nora in her arms and watched the last light leave the sky over the Vermont hills.
The Foundation's researchers had
Gone home for the evening. Constance's car was still in the drive. She had stayed for dinner as she did most Tuesdays and was inside somewhere reading. Arlo was on his own porch, a quarter-mile down the road, visible as a distant light in the tree line. The maple tree Henry had planted stood in the front yard full with summer leaves, enormous and unhurried.
Claire looked at it and thought about the morning she had arrived, the November dark. The rain, the key in her hand. The house breathing when it should have been cold and dead. She thought about the root cellar and the stones and the steel door and the video in the red folder. She thought about the 38th floor and the recording and the sound of handcuffs. She thought about Thomas, who had found the truth and refused to run from it and paid for that refusal with everything.
She thought about him every day. She would think about him every day for the rest of her life. She had stopped trying to think about him less and started trying to think about him rightly, to hold the shape of him accurately, to tell Nora about him with precision rather than sentiment, to give her daughter a father who was true,
rather than a father who was simplified by grief. He had been a man who knew what was right and did it without being certain he would survive it.
Nora had that in her blood. From Thomas and from Henry both. Claire looked at her daughter in the evening light. The dark hair, the gray-blue eyes tracking a moth that had appeared near the porch light. The entire focused attention of a person for whom everything was still new and interesting and without category.
Your grandfather built something in this house, Claire said, something that's going to change how the world runs. Not because it's a clever device, though it is, but because he refused to let the wrong people have it. For 50 years he refused. Nora regarded the moth with complete attention. I was stubborn and secretive, and he kept things from people he loved because he thought he was protecting them,
Claire said. He was right about some of that and wrong about some of it. She paused. But he never stopped.
That's the thing I want you to know about him. Whatever it cost, and it cost him everything, he never stopped.
The moth flew away into the dark. Nora looked up at her mother. Claire looked back.
I don't know what they'll ask of you, Claire said. Whatever is in your blood, his blood. I don't know where it leads. I can't see that far.
She held her daughter's gaze in the evening light. But I know what he gave us. I know what this house is. And I know that whatever comes next, you won't be facing it from nothing. She looked out at the maple tree against the fading sky. You'll be facing it from here, she said.
The porch light held them in its small, warm circle. The Vermont hills darkened into silhouette, the house behind them breathed steadily, all its lights on all its rooms in use, alive, in the way that Henry had built it to be alive, waiting over purpose, restored legacy, passed forward into hands that would carry it into a future he had seen clearly enough to prepare for, and trusted enough to leave without knowing its end. The stars came out one at a time over the hills. Claire held her daughter and waited for them and did not look away.